You can turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 1. We're going to be looking at chapter 1 and 2 this morning. Before we jump into that, I just want to pause for a second and say thank you for the care that you've provided for my family over the last couple of weeks and for your prayers. That means a lot to us, and we are very appreciative of it. And God has used that in amazing ways to encourage us and help us. So thank you for that. And that's sort of like a janky segue into this new series that we're doing, which is about prayer. And in particular, we're looking at prayer in the Old Testament because we're spending this entire year examining different texts from the Old Testament, sort of living in the Old Testament, breathing the Old Testament air for a year. And so we're going to be looking at some different prayers in the Old Testament and looking at some different lessons that we can learn from those prayers. And this morning, we're going to be looking at the prayer of Hannah. And my dad, as I was preparing this, I was thinking about Hannah's situation and this whole text. And my dad had a saying that he used to like to say repeatedly, especially when I was going through a difficult thing. And that is it's a very simple phrase. It's life's hard and then you die. That was not necessarily the most encouraging thing in the moment, but I found that it's true. Life is hard, and that's no less true for a Christian life. The Christian life is hard. There are things about following Christ that are not easy. There are things about living as a Christian that are not easy. Trying to find this balance where we are imaging Christ the best that we can in the totality and complexity of who he is as the God-man. It's a difficult thing, especially when we live in a culture that is against that type of life, that type of virtue, that type of value. And so what we're going to see today is an example of a godly woman who, rather than whining and complaining or bemoaning or feeling sorry for herself, went to the Lord in prayer. So as we look at this text, I want you to ask yourself one question. What is my reflex? What is my reflex? When things get hard, when there are situations that are difficult, when I have trials, when I have struggles, what is my reflex? I think if we were to oversimplify it, maybe we would all fall into one of two categories. Those two categories are either whiners or fixers. Okay, I think when we fall into struggles, we all fall into one of these two categories. And again, I get this as an oversimplification, but we either whine or we try to fix. The whiners sit back and whine about their situation. It might also include complaining, but it's a general attitude of whining as if they're entitled to a smooth life free of trouble. On the other side of that, though, are fixers, and they try to fix their situation and take that into their own hands and fix it themselves. They try to figure out how to change or manipulate the situation and then work in their own power to achieve their goal. When we come into struggles and trials, I think we are either whiners or fixers. And here's the rub, though. Both are not trusting and depending upon the Lord. They both aren't seeing that God is at work in the mess and is using it not only to refine us and make us more dependent upon him, but also to cultivate a deeper, more vibrant relationship with him. Whiners and fixers both miss that. So what I want to do is I just want to look at this story and see what we can pull from it. And the first point is this: God gives us struggles and trials. And we have to be careful here because there are times when we get ourselves into messes because of our own sin or stupidity. That's true. There are also times when our crummy situation is a result of someone else's sin. That can happen also, right? So in this case, in Hannah's case, part of her difficulty, her struggle, her trial came from an outside source. It wasn't originating with her. It was somebody else that was causing struggle and trial and difficulty in her life. In this case, we didn't do anything wrong, but are affected by the sin of others. And then there are times when, try as we may, we cannot come up with any explanation for why we are going through what we are going through. It seems totally random. If you remember back to our series in Esther, you'll remember that one of the big themes throughout that book is that though God seems absent, and though the situation seems random, God is silently and sovereignly overseeing the details of life. The same is true here, and the same is true in your life. So let's look at what we have going on here in 1 Samuel chapter 1. First of all, we're introduced in verse 1 to the husband. His name is Elkanah. He has 2 wives. And so I want to pause here. And the first thing that we need to see is that part of the problem that Hannah faces comes as a result of disobedience to God's design. So this Elkanah has 2 wives. Hannah is one of them. And it doesn't say how she got married. It doesn't say whether she was given to him, like there was some sort of like family agreement where she was basically given by her father to him, or whether she agreed to marry him. It doesn't say which wife was the first wife. It doesn't give us any of those details. But what we do see is that going against God's design never works out well. So in the Old Testament, God tolerated polygamy, but don't confuse toleration with endorsement. A brief survey of polygamous relationships throughout the Old Testament show that going against God's design is never good. It doesn't ever end well. And so as we read the first few verses of 1 Samuel chapter 1, we find a husband, and this husband is really trying to do his best. He's really trying to hold this whole thing together, right? Okay, so some of you, husbands, work with me here. Some of you have thought at certain points, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into when you got married? Right? You have an argument. You have that it's not what you said, it's how you said it moment. Or what's wrong? Nothing. And then you find out 6 days later that there was something wrong, right? We all can identify with that. And in those moments, there can be this thing where I'm like, whoa, I'm in over my head. Now, here's this guy who has this times 2. And these 2 women don't like one another. In fact, his other wife, whose name I forgot because she's only mentioned a couple times, Peninnah, is really hostile toward Hannah. And so here's this guy that's just trying to hold this family together. We see this sort of compassion of Elkanah, and he's really just trying to do his best. He loves Hannah dearly and is trying to comfort her. He tries to show his love for her, but the other wife is kind of a beast. She has children, which is a sign of God's blessing, and Hannah has none. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah because she had no children. Peninnah had experienced God's blessing and then weaponized it, right? And there's turmoil in this family. And maybe one of the things that we need to see is that there are really no perfect families, right? We can all identify with this. In all of our families, we've got that one person. If you don't know who it is, it's you. We have dysfunctional families. Sin has messed up our relationships. And so we can all identify with this and the struggle of dysfunction within a family. And so here's this husband that is in this turmoil and is trying his best to hold things together. A woman who wants children desperately, and a woman who has children and is taunting and lording it over the other wife. That's the situation. And so just from a brief survey of what's going on here in the first few verses of 1 Samuel chapter 1, we see that there are kind of 2 contributing issues. The first one, which we mentioned before, is that there's disobedience to God's design. There's a polygamous relationship that's partially the cause of this turmoil. Had there been a commitment to monogamy as God designed, some of this stuff wouldn't be an issue. But then there's the second issue of this poor woman who wants children but has none, and that fact is used against her. And the result is a difficult and frustrating situation. Now, I want us to see first that there is one person in the universe that can comfort Hannah. One person. And it's not her husband. Look at verse 8. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? He's really trying. He's trying to comfort her. And yet, try as he may, as kind and compassionate of a husband as he is, as much as he tries, he can't satisfy her. Now, we need to maybe incorporate that into our lives. Your husband will not satisfy you. Your wife will not satisfy you. Your children will not satisfy you. There are times, many times, when they are not enough, and we need something more than them. We need something greater than them. He cannot meet her deepest desire. He cannot change the situation. Now think of Hannah for a moment. And this is where I think we can all relate to Hannah. Look at what we're told about her so far. It almost seems as though she's stuck in two competing commands, right? So we're commanded to be content. We're commanded to be content in the situation that we're placed in. And yet, there's also this command that God gives to be fruitful and multiply. So here's Hannah, who has a godly desire for children. And yet God hasn't given her any. And the challenge is, how are you content when you have a godly desire that's not being met? Have you been there? Moreover, there's this other woman who God has apparently prospered and blessed, who is thrown into the mix. And that woman is being a beast to her, so now she has to battle against resentment and bitterness. Can you relate to that? How easy would it be for her to become angry with God, to think God has abandoned her? How easy would it be for her to become jealous and bitter and let that consume her? How hard is that in our own lives? To fight against that temptation to let bitterness and jealousy consume us. Think about the single person that wants to be married but isn't. The couple that wants to have children, but for whatever reason God hasn't given to them. The person who sees other ministries flourishing, but theirs isn't. We all deal with the same kind of thing in our lives. And the answer comes when we remember that God is sovereign over the details of our lives. Behind every situation in our lives is a sovereign hand of God orchestrating His will in our lives. We are, in other words, where He wants us to be. Hannah's situation reminds us that God opens and closes the womb. We see the acknowledgement of that in verse 5. But Hannah gave, in chapter 2, verse 5, those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren have borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. In verse 5 of chapter 1, we see that the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. In verse 6, we see the Lord had closed her womb. Over and over again, we see that God has placed her in this situation. He is the one that has prevented her from having kids. Okay, now let that settle for a second. The reason she did not have children is because God had not given them. In fact, God withheld children from her, which means God gave her this situation. God gave her this struggle and this trial. In her prayer in chapter 2, she recognizes God's sovereignty over the details. Look at verses 6 and 7 in chapter 2. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. He gives trouble and He delivers from trouble. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit the seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them He has set the world. Hannah knows that God is sovereign over the details in his world. And as she pours out thanks to God for this child in chapter 2, she acknowledges that reality. And so many of us like to think that God allows problems in our lives, but we don't like to think that God gives trials and struggles to us. That's uncomfortable. That's really uncomfortable. He didn't merely allow it, he willed it. In Hebrews, we're told that Jesus learned obedience through suffering. God doesn't just allow suffering. At times, he brings it. He gives it. We're told that Jesus was driven into the wilderness to be tested. That's God bringing it about. A while ago, Joe brought this to my attention, and I thought it was a great observation when we were going through James with the middle school and high school students. James starts off, and a lot of us are familiar with this, is count it all joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. But then a little later in the chapter, it says this, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good and every perfect gift comes from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. And verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1 of James are in the same context of count it all joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. So part of the good and perfect gifts that God gives are trials that test our faith and show it to be genuine. And this is all in the context of trials, all in the context of difficulty. And it says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. So one of the things we know we need in trials is wisdom. So maybe if you're struggling, the place to start is by asking for wisdom, knowing that whatever situation you're in, it's part of God's good and perfect gift for you because it's meant to form you and shape you and change you. The point is that God gives it. He doesn't merely allow it. He causes it, and it's a gift. That's really the essence of God working all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose in Romans chapter 8. He is that sovereign. He is that in control. So behind every situation we face and we experience is the hand of a loving sovereign Father who is giving these situations. And we need to remember when we face problems, even though intermediately it might come through human wickedness and brokenness of the world or satanic forces, ultimately those problems are from the Lord. We are where he wants us, and he has a purpose in where he has us. Think of Job. Was God sovereign over Job's suffering? Did he give that? Yes. Was he responsible for it in the sense that Satan was going about doing these really bad things to Job? But why does he do this? Why are trials a gift? Because problems are God's gracious way of teaching us to seek him in a deeper way than we did before. I think I've quoted this before, and I'll probably butcher it, but it's a paraphrase. You never experience the deepest, most lasting satisfaction in God on the primrose path of ease. It's always through suffering and difficulty. You see, suffering and difficulty, trials, struggles, are a gift because they drive us into the arms of our loving Father who is overseeing all of the details of our lives. It reminds us that we're not in control. It reminds us that we have a loving God who is able to deliver us and who is able to work through and in the midst of all of the mess that we're going through to make us more like his Son. Our problems, in other words, are God's gracious way of training us to become like his Son. So the question is, how should we respond to problems? Whine or fix or something else? This is where Hannah is a wonderful example. She responds in prayer. As Christians, we will intellectually affirm the importance and power of prayer, but we practically deny it. And that's shown in our propensity, all of our propensity, mine included, to either whine or fix rather than kneel. We all struggle with this. In fact, we can almost stumble when we read this story because we can think of all the ways Hannah could have responded to the situation, or all the ways, if we're really honest, maybe to put a little sharper edge on this point, all the ways that we would have responded in this situation. This isn't fair. I've been good. Why is this happening to me? I'm done with you, God. You're going to be like Sarah maybe and try to fix it. Hey, go sleep with the servant girl, Abraham. That's how we'll help God fulfill his promises. Maybe we'd have the attitude of, if my husband hadn't married that other woman, blame someone else. Maybe it would have been approaching Elkanah and saying, one of us has to go. I'm done. It's her or me. Which one? Choose now. Or maybe it was go see a therapist who tells her she's depressed and needs to do more self-care and let out her rage against God. Stop enabling your husband. Here's some meds. Hannah's response was very, very, very different. And I would argue much more effective. She poured out her heart and her sorrow and her pain and her desires to God. Look at chapter 1, verses 11 to 16. Starting in verse 10, she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. No razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunk woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put the wine away from you. But Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. And Eli answered, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. Now, she addresses God in this prayer as Lord of hosts. Now, it's a common name for God in the Old Testament, but this is the first time in the Bible that title is used in a recorded prayer. Hannah is approaching God as the only sovereign of the universe who alone has the resources and ability and power and strength to do what she cannot do. Hannah cannot give herself a baby. Only God can do that. So she begins her prayer by acknowledging God's sovereign power and strength, by acknowledging God reigns over his creation, and she begins with who God is. Prayer begins with God, not with us. We need to remind ourselves who God is, who it is we're talking to, who it is we're appealing to, who it is we're pouring our heart out to. This is not only the powerful, all-knowing, all-wise God who can change our situation, who does miracles, who raises people from the dead. He's a loving Father who has compassion for his children, who loves his children, who hears their weeping and their bitterness and their sorrow with tenderness. And if that's who God is, then prayer is not just a nice but impractical and impotent religious exercise. Prayer is our means of access to the all-sufficient God who alone can meet all of our needs. In other words, prayer isn't just a tip of the hat to God before we get down to the real solution and the real business of fixing the problem. Prayer is the solution. Prayer is acknowledging our dependence upon him. It is a God-ordained way for believers to deal with their problems. The very design of prayer, or the very design of problems, is to drive us to our knees in prayer, in dependent appeals to God as our only hope. And in this, it strips us of self-sufficiency. And we're all prone to that, especially in the Midwest. She might have had an ovulation tracker on her phone and been trying for years to get pregnant with a self-dependent attitude. But here, she humbles herself and places herself in a position of dependence, in a position of surrender. in a position of need and not able to give anything in return. It's a simple, faith-filled appeal to the God who is able to change her situation. Notice also that she doesn't just pray for a kid. God gives her one, and then everything lives happily ever after. Hannah prayed something radical. Look at verse 11 of chapter 1. And she vowed a vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. This meant she was dedicating her child to God as a Nazirite, as one separated to serve God. Now just think about this for a minute. This is not bargaining with God. We'll come to that in a second. But this woman is asking for the deepest desire of her heart and then is willing to consecrate that child to God. That brings us to our next point. Pray according to God's purpose. Hannah prayed for a need to be met, but she also prayed to be used by God. And if we just terminate on praying for a need to be met, we miss the larger point of the prayer. Hannah was praying with a Godward aim. She was praying in a way that placed her in a position of service to God. She prayed, or her prayer had at its heart a longing for God's will and God's purposes. She didn't just pray for a child and that's it. She prayed for a child that she could train up to serve God. Now, there's a lot that could be said about parents being stewards of their children and not owners. There's a lot could be said about the primary responsibility of parents being to raise young men and women who will be great in the faith and be willing to be used by God. And while all that's true and important, that's another sermon. What is important for us today is that Hannah doesn't idolize the gift that God gives. She doesn't idolize the child that she longs for. She sees in a right perspective her role in that child's life and that child's who owns that child. She, in other words, saw herself as a steward. The child is not the end. The child is a stewardship for her, and she wants to see the child grow up and serve God. She wants to be an instrument God uses to make that happen. She's not bargaining with God. Give me a child and I'll give him to you. No, this is an expression of a heart that longs to be used to form a soul that has been entrusted to her. This is the longing of a woman who is ready to do work for the kingdom. It says a lot about the influence and power of a godly mom, doesn't it? Timothy became a Christian because of a godly mother and grandmother. So don't ever belittle motherhood. You're not just a mom. You are playing an indispensable role in the formation of a soul. You are entrusted with a little image bearer to form and train to be a follower of Jesus, to wreak havoc on an unbelieving world through faith armed with the gospel, to do bold things for the kingdom that people write about. A godly mother is, I think, the single most impactful influence in the life of a child. Now, you couple that with a godly father, and hell shudders in fear. And that's why the family is under attack in our culture. Because a godly husband and a godly wife raising godly children to know and love and trust Jesus shakes the gates of hell. So Hannah is praying to be used by God in the role of motherhood to influence and shape a soul to do great things for God. And from this, we learn that the purpose of prayer is not to make your life easy. Do you think it was easy for her to hand her child over at 3 to 5 years old? Do you think the ridicule went away when she had Samuel? No, it just changed. Oh, you've only got one. I've got 6. You still still not up to par. The purpose of prayer is the glory of God and his will. Remember what Jesus prayed? Not my will, but yours be done. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Hannah prays for a son that she can mold and shape to be used by God, and God is after the same aim. She is praying according to God's purposes. The point is that God wants us to pray not only for our needs and desires, but also for his purposes to be fulfilled through the answers he gives to our prayers. And Hannah not only prayed that way, but she followed through on her commitment. She gave her son to Eli to work in the tabernacle. Now think how hard that would be. It's often very easy to commit to something before God when it's an idea or a possibility. It's a very different thing when it's a reality. And the point is, Hannah's prayer was sincere. She really meant what she said. She really saw herself as an instrument to bring this child to be used by God. It wasn't just platitudinal. It wasn't lip service. It was genuine. It was authentic. And just as she gave him, she also continued to care for him. We see that she brought him little robes that she made every year when she would come to make sacrifices. She loved this boy, and yet she was true to her word. Just something to encourage you a little bit here. Hannah gave her only son to the service of God, and Eli blessed her and her husband when they came to make sacrifices in chapter 2, verse 20, if you go over there. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord," so they would return to their home. Indeed, verse 21, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. She bore 3 sons and 2 daughters beyond Samuel. God did not forget her faithfulness. God did not forget her godliness and her sincerity and her commitment to him. And there's a lesson in this for us. God's blessing and grace are beyond what we can imagine and hope for. She prayed for 1 child. God gave her 5 more. God is in the business of blessing his faithful people, and that blessing is not stingy, it's lavished. God isn't stingy with his grace or blessing. And that brings us to our final point. Answered prayer leads to praise. Hannah prayed another prayer. This one's found in the beginning of chapter 2. And the beginning of this particular prayer might sound familiar because it's very close to the prayer of thanksgiving and praise that a young woman named Mary gave when she found out that she would bear the Messiah. Hannah likely prayed this prayer after she left her son with Eli, probably between 3 and 5 years old. I say that because of verse 11 of chapter 2, which as soon as this prayer is over, Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. So I think this was later on, and as she gave her child and committed or followed through on her commitment. And in this prayer, she exalts the greatness of God and human weakness. She acknowledges that God brings problems and delivers from them in verse 6, as we've already read, but I just want to leave us with verse 9. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in the darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. So Hannah responded by praising God, and then she has this amazing statement in verse 9. Not by might shall man prevail. It is not our strength. It is not our ability. How do we prevail? We prevail by going to him in absolute weakness and need and faith and calling out to him so that it is abundantly clear when he answers, it is his doing and not our strength that produced that result. In other words, God doesn't help those who help themselves. He helps those who cannot help themselves, those who are helpless and flee to him. Those who call out to him in sincere faith. That's what grace is. It's God showering his blessing and favor on people who don't deserve it, who can't pay it back, and are aware of their weakness. By the way, an interesting fact, the name Hannah in Hebrew means grace. So Hannah didn't get help from the religious establishment. Eli thought she was drunk. His sons were a bunch of piles. They were in ministry for their own gain and sensual desire, and Eli didn't confront them in that. But she knew God, she knew herself, and she went to the Lord in prayer. The story of Hannah and her prayer is really a story of God's lavish grace. Our problem is usually that we think of ourselves as too strong rather than too weak. We trust ourselves and think maybe we just need a little boost from God. Maybe that'll fix it. That's not what we need. There's a unique glory and praise that's ascribed to God when we can say, I was helpless and hopeless. I cried to God. He delivered me. To God alone be the glory. And God is still looking for men and women like Hannah, people who have struggles and problems and will bring those problems humbly to God, trusting in him alone, and be willing to be used by him however he wants. Our culture needs people of prayer. We need men and women who will stand against the tide of even religious establishment and be people of prayer. And it applies to us not only individually in each of our lives, but also collectively as a church. Hannah was one of thousands of women, yet through her the whole nation was blessed. A godly woman had a problem, prayed according to God's power or God's purpose, and unto his praise. And all of it was not by might that she prevailed. It was in humble, weak appeals to God, who is powerful and who is mighty and who is able to overcome that situation and deliver his people from their despair and meet their needs. We need that same thing today. Let's pray.